everyone, Julian Charles here again of themindrenewed.com, podcasting to you from the depths of the Lancashire countryside here in the UK. Welcome to podcast number 51, which is the continuation of an interview that I had with Mike Kenner last week, who is an open government campaigner and Cold War researcher who is specialising in the history of the activities of Porton Down, the UK Ministry of Defence's Biological and Chemical Weapons Research Centre in Wiltshire. And as I said last time, the interview itself was extremely long. It is in fact the longest interview that I've conducted to date, about 3 hours long, so I did feel that it was necessary to split it into two podcasts. So this is the second half. Last week we were concentrating very much on Porton's use of biological simulants to simulate biological weapons, but this week we're concentrating on their use of chemical simulants. Now, the strange thing is that as I've been editing this, and in fact as I'm speaking now, I am addressing you from my bed because although I'm not seriously ill, please do not worry, I have injured my back in some way. I don't know how I did it, but here I am, lying here doing the editing and now speaking from my bed. And I'm not calling for any messages of sympathy because I'm quite sure that I shall be absolutely fine in a couple of days from now, but it's just coincided with getting this podcast out. So I thought I'd tell you that in case there's something strange about the way I'm speaking or the bed covers rustling or something like that. Anyway, that's the way it is. If, of course, you haven't heard the first part, I do encourage you to go and listen to that before you engage with this particular podcast. Next week's podcast will be with Dr. Frederick vom Saal, a biology professor from the University of Missouri-Columbia, and I shall be talking to him about his concerns over the substance bisphenol A, more commonly known as BPA, which is included in many of the plastics that we use on an everyday basis, and his research has led him to be extremely concerned about that substance in terms of its toxicity and its effect on human health. So I'm very much looking forward to sharing with you that conversation. But for now, we turn to the second part of the conversation with Mike Kenner. So can we move on to the biological warfare trials using chemicals? Now, this seems to involve mainly the use of a compound in dust form called zinc cadmium sulfide, which you mentioned earlier on. So I want to ask you about the substance itself in a few minutes, but first, could you tell us a little bit more about the East Lulworth trials that you've already mentioned, and perhaps the Salisbury City trials?
Yeah, I mean, both of these trials that you're talking about, they involve the use of this mysterious substance called zinc cadmium sulfide. A little bit of context, let's give you that. Most people think that biological warfare trials, and indeed the British government thought that it would be a good way to do it, will be conducted with cluster munitions. That is, a bomb containing a lot of little miniature bomblets, each containing bacterial suspension. And you need a massive fleet of bombers to go over a city, drop the bombs, and hope that you've managed to spread the disease. Now, they realise after a while that this is totally impractical. The whole idea of biological warfare and probably chemical warfare is the element of surprise. The minute someone knows you're coming or they can hear you're coming, they put on their respirators and that's it. Game over. You've just wasted your time. And they didn't really know what to do, but the scientists at Porton Down developed a theory called the large area coverage concept. Like I say, it's the idea that a ship, a submarine, an aircraft, even a guided missile could fly a straight line track 10 miles, 20 miles off the coast of the UK, spray in a bacteria. This will get blown onshore and be carried a couple hundred miles inland. It's an incredible idea. Now, obviously, they weren't going to jump straight in and use bacteria on this, so they decided that they'd use a substance called zinc cadmium sulfide. Each particle of zinc cadmium sulfide was between 1 and 5 microns in size, so it would penetrate the deepest part of the lungs of anyone that breathed it in. So that was an ideal biological warfare simulant. Now, the reason that they used this substance was that under ultraviolet light, it fluoresced. So that if you took air samples, you could actually count how many particles per litre of air per minute were collected at a certain point in the target area. All you did is shone an ultraviolet light on the sampling equipment and physically counted the amount of particles present. The other reason that they use it is it was incredibly cheap. Now, the only drawback was that the tins came marked hazardous material. So Porton Down decided that it would be a very good idea that anybody that's handling this or in close contact with this material, they would wear a home office respirator, surgeon's cap, neoprene elbow length gloves, overalls and gum boots. Members of the public, not so lucky. Anyway, what they used to do, the first large area coverage trials, they loaded a couple £100 of this stuff into an aircraft. They had a crude dispensing device originally. It was hand operated. And it was basically someone having jars of zinc cadmium sulfide and physically dumping them into a spraying mechanism that would spray out the side of a plane. And what it would do was fly down the east coast and then along the south coast of the UK. Sometimes it would go up the Irish Sea. And it would spray it all during that track, normally between 100 and 200 mile track. Now, the Swanage or the East Lulworth trial that you're talking about is a very curious one because you normally spray this material at a rate of about £1 of material per mile. So they carried on doing that on this trial of 1 August, 18th of August in the late 50s. So the plane came along the south coast. And something happened. They stopped when they got just off of Swanage, about 10 miles off of Swanage. If you stop spraying off of Swanage, the resulting cloud will be carried directly over the village of East Lulworth and to the sampling point, which was about 20 miles away at Dorchester, just outside Dorchester in Dorset. Now, the sampling device at Dorchester collected a phenomenal amount of particles. It was 4,300. And the rest of the country were probably about 10 or lower. Now, something obviously went very, very badly wrong.
So do we have any indication as to whether that was deliberate or was that an accident?
No one knows. Porton Down have never responded on it. What is thought that might have happened is that they hadn't been using the zinc cadmium sulfide at a fast enough rate and they had a lot left, and someone inadvertently just thought he'd dump it out the plane. Another thought is the fact that there was a sudden meteorological shift. This is Porton wondering whether a sudden meteorological complication had occurred which had blown everything into one place in South Dorset. I tend to go for human error.
That seems much more plausible indeed.
It does, yeah. Now, the Salisbury trials, they were sort of like how to attack a city at night. They built a grid of sampling stations in the countryside around Salisbury, which was their home city. And then they went to people's gardens in the city itself, and they built another network, a smaller network of sampling stations. So you had a rural network and an urban network. And then a plane would fly a 40-mile track about 100 miles away over to the west so that the wind would blow the material over the city. And what they were trying to see was whether the heat of a city at night would cause more of the bacteria to fall onto the city or whether it would be less. In other words, it's offensive work. And they were a little bit naughty, really. They did their normal cover story. If you're asked by a member of the public, what are you doing at night with your strange sampling devices? You're doing atmospheric pollution work.
Because these were set up in people's gardens, you said?
Yeah. And what they told the city to get permission, their actual cover story for this one was the inhabitants of the area were told that the trials were to study smoke pollution of the air. They were most cooperative.
Smoke pollution?
Smoke pollution of the air, because the current thing in vogue then was the smog of London.
Right. So that was definitely a lie. Yes.
Yeah. So if you come along and you say, look, we're investigating, trying to work out how to get rid of smog, people can say, well, of course, come into my garden.
So this wasn't even weasel words.
No. They said in the trials document, the real reason for the trials was to gather data which would be of direct use in the estimation of weapon expenditure in a gas attack on the town. So they were quite blatant in it, that they lied. During the Lime Bay trials, anyone that was called out, a sampler that was called out, he was told if anyone asked you what you're doing in the field, the only permissible answer is that you are sampling atmospheric pollution for meteorological research. A persistent questioner may be viewed with suspicion but told nothing further. You must not describe your activities to anyone, e.g. colleagues, friends or relatives. And of course, Graydon Carter, who was the Porton scientist and official historian, he went on in an internal review to say the cover story about meteorological and air pollution work was readily constructive for any inquisitive inquirer. Both aspects were, of course, not incorrect. That passes for humour in Porton Down.
Right, okay, yeah. You mentioned also the spraying on the east coast. Norfolk was sprayed, I understand, and in fact large areas along the east coast. And this is the same substance, zinc cadmium sulfide?
Yeah, in the Norwich trials, they were done in 1963 and 64. They were a follow-on. They found that Salisbury wasn't a good enough area topographically. They got inconclusive results, so they wanted to do them again. So what they did is a very similar process. They built a rural network of sampling points around Norwich and then an urban set of points within Norwich. The trials document for this is a little bit more open. It does show how involved the City of Norwich police were. They even operated some of the sampling equipment. The control site was based in the police main headquarters. The Home Office came along with their scientific advisory branch. They were involved. This was a very, very big trial.
And do you feel that all the people that were in the establishment there that you've just described will be aware of what was going on, or do you think they were lied to as well?
The Home Office scientific advisors definitely knew what was going on. The ordinary plod that was operating the sampler, he didn't have a clue what he was doing. No one probably below the level of Chief Constable was fully aware of what was going on, and he might not have even been told fully. Now, the interesting thing is that the program notes for this, and the program notes are the instructions to be carried out by all members that are involved in the trials, say that the substance to be dispersed will be silicon-treated zinc cadmium sulfide. Curiously, they say this substance is quite innocuous in the concentrations that will occur near the ground, and the cloud will moreover be so diffuse that members of the public will be oblivious of its presence. So they were very concerned. They realised these were politically sensitive trials.
But they believed that they wouldn't actually cause any harm, so they said.
Well, this is it. You see, they don't dispute that the material is hazardous at all. What they dispute is whether the amount that was inhaled by each person would have been enough to cause harm. I mean, they went on with this. I mean, you can see how concerned they were. They told all Porton Down personnel not to wear anything that has any lettering on it that suggests that they come from CDEE. Or Porton Down. No one's to know. This comes down in the infamous Profumo briefing note. Profumo, in the very year that he was going through the Christine Keeler scandal, he raised a curious question at an Army Department meeting. He must have heard somewhere along the line that these trials were being done. And he decided that he wanted more information. So the chief scientist for the War Office, Dr. Kaywood, he wrote a very small 2-page briefing note, but he put a covering letter on it. And the covering letter's got a classic final paragraph. I am convinced of the vital need for these trials, which impose no hazard to the public, although clearly knowledge of them by unauthorized persons could be politically embarrassing. And thereby lies the nub. They weren't really worried about anything except for could it cause an election. Unauthorized persons in there, you can tell what that means. That means voters. You know, if you're a member of the City of Norwich and you find out you're being sprayed with a couple of heavy metals and Porton Down say it's safe to do so, you're probably going to be quite annoyed with your local MP.
And of course, I do want to ask you more about the toxicity of this substance. But while we're in this particular area of the country, I mean, in the Clouds of Secrecy documentary, there was a village mentioned called Halvergate, and there was a lady who was interviewed called, I believe her name was Yvonne Jarman, and she said that several people in her family had died specifically from esophageal cancer.
Yeah.
Though there was no record of that in her family prior to these tests being carried out. So I know that's very anecdotal, but when I saw that, I thought it was quite striking.
Yeah, that was the curious thing. When the people in Norwich became aware of what was going on, they were quite, amazed, as you can imagine. And then the newspapers picked up on it up there. And then an incredible number of cases were coming forward, and it was always esophageal cancer. And there does seem to be a higher than normal incidence of that in that area, which did lead people to think, well, could it have anything to do with this? And it may well have. But it's just that no one has looked into it. No one really looks into it. You see, the problem that we have is that Porton were only doing, I suppose, what would be considered as Cold War standards of health and safety.
Yeah. Sure, but it was very striking seeing that testimony there by the lady. Certainly, well, it is. Certainly made me think.
I haven't heard of any other area that was hit with zinc cadmium sulfide that was hit so intensely apart from Cardington and Bedford.
Sure, and that's what I want to ask you about next, because that's a very, very small village, isn't it, with just a few hundred people, but was it not sprayed from a van making its way around the village?
Yeah, the Cardington trials were mainly done because they wanted to find out how high up and in what concentrations the particles rose to. So quite handily for them, at Cardington was the balloon development establishment. So they could get what was essentially a barrage balloon, put samplers on the guy wire at certain heights, let the barrage balloon up, and then they'd go around the countryside spraying. Curiously, it appears that on these trials, and they did over 40 of them, they used a converted Morris van. I say curiously, it's a very clandestine vehicle. Initially, whenever they did spray trials along a road using zinc cadmium sulfide, they did it quite openly with two men wearing gas masks and an open-top Land Rover with this spraying machine on the back.
It's a pretty frightening thing to see, I should think.
Yeah, well, what it did is it tended to slow traffic down. And I think that the main reason that they moved over to a clandestine van is, the locals won't realise we're up to something, and it won't cause traffic jams. It's just a doddery old van going along. So you had this van with a couple of men in the back wearing all their full protective kit. It sounds comical now, but the end event wasn't. And then there was a pipe in the roof, and the material was disseminated out through there. Now, there's a great danger here, because the closer you are to the source of the material, the higher the concentration, obviously. And this van was just travelling down a normal street, so you could be up to less than a metre away.
Well, what was the purpose in doing this in that particular area? Could they not have done this in a completely uninhabited area?
It was purely all to do with budget. It was purely because the balloon development establishment were based at RAF Cardington. They're used to seeing the balloons go up and down, so it wouldn't have caused any talk amongst the public. They used it later in 1959 when they sprayed the area with bacteria from a converted Canberra jet bomber.
I mean, I can understand that, the general geographical argument there. Okay, so it was near to this balloon place. Okay, yeah. But why choose the village? I mean, why not just go...
Oh, they went roaming right around that area. It wasn't just the village.
Yeah, well, why include the village? Why include the village at all?
Well, this is Porton Down. They could have done all of these trials on the enormous range in Canada. It's purely budget reasons. It was cheaper to come down to Lyme Bay. It was cheaper to go to Cardington. So beware a chancellor. If the chancellor says that it's austerity time, then they're going to spray you with the cheapest material possible.
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it, sure. Now, there was a review of the zinc cadmium sulfide trials. I believe this was in 1999, led by Professor Peter Lachman, looking into the toxic effects of these trials. I heard him in one of the programs, and he concluded that there was no harm done to the public. But he did actually admit in that program that he hadn't seen all the evidence. Is that right?
Yeah. It's only personal opinion, but I did have contact with him before he started his independent review. First off, let me point out that they had great difficulty in getting any scientists to be involved in doing a review into the zinc cadmium sulfide trials. For whatever reasons, they were trying to find a scientist for many, many months. In the end, Professor Lachman, who was just starting out his Academy of Medical Sciences, he's the founder, he said that he'd come forward and he'd do it. And he assembled a small team, and they, from what I gather, went to Porton Down, and a load of documents were shoved on a table, and they studied the documents, and they probably took them away, but not for very long. And they assumed that they'd been given everything. And it turned out that they weren't given the spraying of Norwich. They weren't given the Cardington documents. They weren't given the radioactive documents that was done from Harwell. I mean, that was quite a serious one.
So this is why he says, this is his quote, "I don't suppose it was done in built-up areas or that there were people about."
This is it.
Because he didn't know.
He wouldn't know. And he makes assumptions, which I find very curious from a scientist, to make assumptions. You go by the available evidence, obviously, and if he doesn't realise that a vehicle travelling down a road spraying a material is close proximity to a member of the public, well, then there's nothing much I can do about that. But
he wasn't told of that one, you say? He wasn't told about the Cardington trial?
Oh, yeah, he hasn't been told about Cardington, but I think he knew about the spraying of Bristol. I think that was 1961. And that was where they openly used the Land Rover, like I say, with two men wearing respirators and whatever. And then I found out afterwards that there was many more trials that were associated with the spraying of Bristol. Just like the spraying of Norwich, they brought out one document that had trials results in it. Then we find out that there were proposed to be another 4 to 8, and no one knows whether they were done or they weren't done. But to have somebody say conclusively, look, there can't have been a danger, but not realise that he hasn't been given all the information, well, that speaks for itself, really.
It does. I think it's a warning to us, isn't it? Because I'm not commenting upon him particularly, but there is generally with these kinds of statements a certain tone about it, isn't there, of a kind of faith in the establishment that's evinced there. No, there couldn't possibly be. And, it depends upon what kind of person you are listening or seeing these things. But nevertheless, I think a lot of people would think, oh, yes, that's spoken with great authority. That must be true. And yet here we have evidence that, well, not everything was known, so we can't really trust those statements.
Yeah, I quite agree. I think that there was a culture of, how can you put it, I'm a senior scientist, and those working at Porton Down are well-recognised, well-published senior scientists. We're not going to try and pull the wool over each other's eyes. We're all part of the same club. I think that when something is independent, I would have more liked to have seen more lay members involved. I'm a lay person. You know, my scientific training is down to the fact that I know to look something up. But if I get a document and I see an anomaly on it, then I'll investigate further on that anomaly.
I absolutely agree with you. I think with many of the issues, certainly the issues we're looking at here on this podcast here, I think it's so important actually that lay people, ordinary people, non-experts look into these things, because that way you can uncover things.
They have a different set of eyes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, we've got different eyes. I did feel that the second report, the one that looked into zinc cadmium sulfide, was more hurried than the first report. I was very concerned that he hadn't been given all the material, and I'm not suggesting in any way that is any fault of Professor Lackman's. That is obviously the fault of Porton Down. It's very tempting to say there's a grand conspiracy to try and hide material. I think that 9 times out of 10, from my experience with Porton Down, it is just a laxity. They don't care. You know, you've got to do an internal review, produce these documents for Professor Lackman, and they go down to their archive, but they probably only got a very small amount of time that they're meant to do it. The person that's doing it doesn't really know what he's doing. You know, the same thing happened to Professor Spratt, we mustn't forget. He wasn't told about the 1975 set of trials. 24 biological warfare trials involving the dissemination of live bacteria, and he wasn't told.
Yes, I was trying to, I wish I could drag up a quote from him, which I was going to put in earlier on. I thought, no, I'll wait. Now I can't find it.
Yeah, the quote for him on that was, he should have been told. And I think I should have been told. That was the closest I've seen Professor Spratt to getting very annoyed. He was told that the DICE trials involved the release of material on the Porton Ranges, very small doses. And he went along with that. Whereas I'd managed to get hold of an internal review produced by a former Porton scientist, Graydon Carter. And in that review, they admitted that 24 trials have been done down here in Weymouth. So I then campaigned for a long time, and it's a very long time. It wasn't until 2010 that I managed to get the actual trials document, and Porton Down refused to let me have their copy of it because they said it was an American document. I had to go through the American Freedom of Information Act. That took the best part of a year. They were very good, actually. And in the end, they released it to me. But they still had to get permission. It was a very strange situation. Porton Down said they couldn't let me have the document because it was an American document. And I needed American permission. So I got American permission. The Americans then said to me they couldn't release it to me because they had to get permission from the British.
Yes.
So in the end, I said that this is a ridiculous situation, pointed it out to them. And they had to go to the British ambassador in Washington to get the permission from him to release the document. It was a ridiculous situation. And what it turned out in the end is that, yes, the Americans had done another series of collaborative trials with the British. The British were looking to adopt an American detection device called the XM-19. And they set it up at Portland Bill. And what they did is they had a ship. It wasn't the Icewell this time. The ship had a Land Rover strapped to it. It was going around in extremely choppy seas. It was a terrible time for a trial, apparently.
Absolutely. Well, we were down there only a few weeks ago, down there at the lighthouse. So, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you know what the race is like.
Absolutely.
Yeah, off of Portland Bill.
Knocked off my feet almost.
Yeah, the poor scientists were out there. They were on there. They were spraying 2 types of bacteria, Serratia marcescens, but it was inactivated. Now, they didn't say killed, they just said inactivated, so we don't quite know what that means, but it wasn't live. But they also sprayed at the same time BG, our good old friend BG. Then the people of Portland were getting sometimes up to 3 of those trials per day. Huge doses come flying in at them. Now, there's a very curious thing that happened that really does bring us back to what our ministers told. The Secretary of State for Defence in 1975, which I've said before was Roy Mason, he received a document. It was a briefing document about these trials, and it said the proposal is that they would hold a field trial at Portland Bill within the AUWE compound. In these trials, killed bacteria would be released into the atmosphere in the form of a harmless aerosol. So he signed off on this, and his permanent secretary put a covering note over the top, said, Minister, this seems reasonable to me as the tests are all to be done on Ministry of Defence sites. So the minister's thinking they're going to release a little tiny bit of harmless bacteria within the AUWE compound, a compound no more than 100 yards by 200. He was not told that a ship was going to sail across Lyme Bay or Weymouth Bay or the English Channel aiming at Portland and that the resulting cloud would go up to 200 miles inland. He wasn't told that. And obviously, I very much doubt he would have signed off on it. And then what they decided to do is quite interesting. A suitable press release will be prepared in case the existence of the tests become public knowledge. Attached is a copy of the press release, which was prepared in 1971 when a somewhat similar series of tests were carried out. All concerned will, of course, be briefed to avoid publicity as far as possible. So they were just sitting there, biting their nails, waiting for the public to discover. And even though it appears afterwards half of Weymouth knew that something was going on, no one raised it in the press. But of course, there would have been a D notice gone out anyway.
Sorry, a D notice?
A defence advisory notice. That's advice to the editor of a newspaper or to a news editor of any media like radio or television saying that this is something to do with national interest. We would be very grateful if you didn't broadcast this. And what they mean by that is if you do broadcast it, we will withdraw all support with you in the future. Right. And 9 times out of 10, most editors, even today, will still go along with a D notice. And sometimes you have to issue a D notice. I'm not totally against D notices, but they are open to abuse.
So this means that no journalism takes place with respect to that at all at that moment, is that?
I mean, at the time, deference was everything, you know. I mean, if a D notice flew through to the local Echo, he'd be dead chuffed and probably frame it.
Right.
You know. Yeah. But at the same time, it's very hard to work out whether a D notice would have been necessary. A lot of times people say that these tests were done in secret. A lot of people that aren't in the know say that, they had to be done in secret because we didn't want the Soviets to know. Whereas the Ministry of Defence, in their documents, are quite open about the fact that they watched the Soviet trawlers turn up in 1963. They had advanced knowledge that the tests were coming. They were watching it all. There is a local story. I mean, it is true because I know the person that witnessed it. A chap came down between Abbotsbury Hill and West Bay. There's a series of hills and lonely cottages and whatever. And one chap turned up there that overlooked Lyme Bay. And he was a Russian linguistic translator. And he stayed there for 5 years while the trials were going on and then went home. So I'd imagine he had a huge pair of binoculars and a very good radio. Yeah, no, the Russians were well aware of what was going on.
Yes, I get the impression with all sorts of things that everybody knows what's going on, to be honest.
Yeah, except for the public.
Yeah, indeed.
The public are the last to know.
Yeah.
The one people that did know was probably local hoteliers, because there was a class system that was operating that the senior scientists stayed at the Moonfleet Hotel. Lesser scientists, they stayed at sort of like smaller hotels within Weymouth and in White Regis, and the sampling operators stayed in digs. There were up to 70 personnel involved in this. You know, it's quite an influx.
Cool. Yeah, so I still want to ask you a bit more about the toxicity of this zinc cadmium sulfide.
Yeah, sure.
And you said that it was known by Porton Down that this was a toxic substance. There's no doubt about that. But the issue really is what the concentration was when it was used in these various trials. But I must ask you about this toxicity of the compound. Could you explain to us what is known of the effects of the actual zinc cadmium sulfide and the release of cadmium that can happen from it?
Well, the main thing that people concentrate on is the fact that it can go for the kidneys, from what I've understood. It could cause, severe problems there. And this is a very interesting thing about the substance that was sprayed. I won't talk so much about cadmium. I'd rather talk about the entire compound. No studies on its toxicity are known. This is very, very strange thing. Even Porton Down, they've looked everywhere for it. So did Professor Lackman. And they found out that no studies have been done on either inhalation or digestion. In fact, the Porton internal history into it says no toxicity experiments of inhaled zinc cadmium sulfide are available in literature, i.e. scientific literature. And no oral studies were done. The Porton scientist that looked into this, he did an internal review for the Ministry of Defence, and this was given to Professor Lackman. And he says in there that he's found very little evidence that the toxicology of this substance, he calls it FP for fluorescent particles, was ever conducted. He says essentially there is no evidence that the toxicity of FP was examined in any practical way by Porton Down. There is no T number for the compound. The absence of such a number indicates that there was no formal toxicity testing at Porton Down. There are no records in the archives of its being tested for toxicity, and that there are no CDE reports on its toxicity even to this day. He says that it's a curious substance in that there is so little data on its toxicity, and more interestingly, no earlier concern about any hazards to the general public from using it in these experiments. So Porton knew that it was hazardous, because this article goes on to say it was regarded as a hazardous compound, but they still went ahead. They didn't subject it to any toxicity tests whatsoever, but thought that it was okay to spray it on the general public. Mind-boggling.
Yeah, indeed. But you say the situation today is not that much different.
No one has conducted an inhalation toxicity study on it. Studies have been done on rats, I believe, but I'm loath to think that anything that's done on an animal can be just crossed straight over to a human. Professor Spratt felt the same way, didn't he?
Yeah. I suppose the thing that concerns me about this is that, well, certainly, of course, the fact that it wasn't tested in the first place, that was a great concern. But also the fact that, I've got in front of me here a 2004 publication, this is a US publication for the National Academies, when they're looking into zinc cadmium sulfide. And in it, if I remember correctly, they say that it's possible for cadmium to be released from this compound under various conditions. And then they go on to discuss the toxicity of cadmium itself. Now, I'll just read their little sentence they've got here. The greatest risk from inhaled cadmium is to the lungs, causing lung cancer. Inhaled cadmium is most toxic to lungs, kidneys, and the skeletal system. There are epidemiological links of cadmium exposure with lung and prostate cancer in humans, and it goes on and on and on. So certainly cadmium is very, very clearly toxic there, but they do seem to suggest somewhere in this article that there is a possible release of this from zinc cadmium sulfide.
Yeah, funnily enough, Lachman does mention, and he does refer to the National Academy of Sciences report on zinc cadmium sulfide. He sort of says that, I think it was him or it was Carter, that draws attention to the fact that they concentrated more on the cancer side than anything else. He reported himself that there was no real reports of a rise in renal failure, i.e. kidney disease, in the areas where this was conducted. But we are talking, I'm afraid, of 40 years after the event. And you have to remember that there were no epidemiological studies being conducted at the time. It would have been a different matter if somebody had said, look, we're going to do these trials. Can we now start taking note of the population and see if it affects them? And of course, that didn't happen. So it's very, very hard, even if we could have a great big document that says, look, this stuff is definitely dangerous. It would be very hard to draw a conclusion that inhalation of this stuff caused any particular person's individual illness. And that's where Porton always managed to escape. Mm. Professor Spratt said it to me when I saw him, and he sort of mentions it in his report, that any of the biological simulants that were sprayed, if people did experience ill effects from them, they would have suffered infections of the chest or infections of the blood, both of which were common. So any GP wouldn't have noticed anything. Even if there'd been an epidemic of it, he would have just put it down to something environmental, but he wouldn't have known that it was Porton Down. And in fact, we did have something down here called the Portland bug. At the same time, Bridport had the Bridport bug and Lyme had the Lyme bug. All around Lyme Bay, at the same time, there was outbreaks of what is known as D&V, diarrhea and vomiting. It was put down at the time that the water at Portland wasn't very good, water quality. But was it?
Yeah, sure.
And you got to remember sometimes as well, these experiments went wrong because they are, after all, experiments.
Well, indeed. As you say, the East Lulworth experiment seemed to go wrong. And that's the other side of the equation, isn't it? There's the question as to the toxicity of the substance itself, but also the amount of exposure the population gets. And in that case, we have an extraordinary exposure. And yet, we're told in the Academy of Medical Sciences 1999 study for the MOD here in the UK, they say that it didn't deliver unusually high doses of zinc cadmium sulfide, so the effects should generally be considered negligible, I think they say somewhere in the document. Well, what about East Lulworth?
Yeah, there's the other fact as well. Professor Lachman caught one point about the sampling equipment, but he missed a very important other point. It did annoy me at the time because he is the senior scientist, and I was very surprised that he and his team missed it. The main sampling device that was used was called a drum impactor. If you can imagine like a very small vacuum cleaner sucking in, a very small orifice for that, a vacuum being applied to it, and a piece of tape that's stuck to the outside of a drum, and this drum rotates sort of like once every minute. You have to physically do it, or once every 5 minutes. So any particles that are in the air get drawn in and they get stuck to it. Now, it had a major failing. It would get obscured by pollution. So it not only sucked in zinc cadmium sulfide, it was sucking soot. And that soot would go over the top of the zinc cadmium sulfide. And when the UV light is shone on it, they reckoned that whatever number you saw there should be doubled. It had a 50% rate of failure, this device. The Americans never used it. They always used something called the rotorod or the micropore. So the 50% figure Lachman admits. Then you come along and you get hold of another Porton document and you find out that the drum impactor has also got another fault to it. And that is that the shiny surface on it means that you can miss whatever result that you see on there should be multiplied by 100.
Right.
So whatever happened down here, the trial's results say 4,300. You've got to double that. So now we're 8,600. And then we're going to put 2 noughts on it.
Right, so it could be anything, basically.
Yeah.
That's the most ridiculous fudge factor I've ever heard of.
Yeah, but what we're talking about is 2 levels of magnitude higher than Professor Lachman says it was. Now we are into significant figures. And he missed it, and I do not understand how he missed that.
So I suppose one of the main questions that really needs to be asked is if we can have confidence that this kind of thing is not going on at the moment and is not going to go on in future. Can you tell us? Do you know?
Well, the latest one that I do know about, I mean, we go back to 1999, and I wrote a request to DERA, that's the Defence Evaluation Research Agency. They were the people at the time responsible for Porton Down. And I asked them what were the procedures going to be for any future trials. And they turned around and told me that ministers have confirmed that they cannot rule out conducting larger scale trials in public areas in the future if there was a military need. Then lo and behold, in 2001, we had the anthrax scare in America, which caused enormous panic over here. We think it caused panic in America, but it was generated over here too. So there was a military need. So if they have conducted any further trials, they've certainly been quiet about it. I inquire every year, every 2 years, and say, what have you been doing this year? And they're meant to tell me. But if it's in the national interest, I don't believe that they would. In 2006, I inquired again and I said, look, is this policy still extant? They said it was. It was still in force. I don't know what the new administration have been doing, the current administration. Now, when the anthrax scare went ahead, the Cabinet Office went ballistic and they got straight onto the Health and Safety Executive and virtually ordered them to immediately conduct a series of trials to see whether anthrax could be carried through the Royal Mail. And to do that, the HSE hit the panic button. And they decided, right, what we're going to do is pick 3 Royal Mail sorting offices. There's Sheffield and Mount Pleasant, and I think it was Nottingham. And we're going to conduct these trials. And we're going to use live bacteria. What shall we use that simulates anthrax? So they settled on BG. Now, I managed to do a code of practice on access to government information request to them. And they, at the time, they came up with the goods, which I was quite amazed. And I've got all their emails. And the emails show that there was a lot of confusion going on. And they didn't really know how safe BG was. So one of them went on the internet and looked up BG and found out that the Los Alamos laboratory wanted to do public area trials with BG. And that seemed to be safe enough for them. What the HSE didn't seem to realize at the time is that the Los Alamos trials were going to use irradiated BG, i.e. killed. So anyway, they went ahead. Now, what the HSE always have to do is, if they're going to conduct anything dubious of this manner, then they have to go ahead and have a word with their ethics committee and say, look, we're going to expose members of the public to something here. Do you think that ethically that's okay with you? Would you run it past the committee? In this case, there was such a panic going on that permission was granted for the trials to go ahead, and the ethics committee were told about them afterwards. So that's a public safeguard, just disappeared. Now, we're only talking a matter of days here, but it still means that the people that are charged with looking after our safety ignored their own safety protocols. Another thing is that they were working with a material that they hadn't really researched properly. Oh. The one good thing that they did is that they realized that postmen were going to be subjected to inhalation of this material. So they did pass out an informed consent sheet, an information sheet and an informed consent sheet that they had to sign. But the problem is that it was virtually worthless because they turned around and said that the tracer that is going to be used is a harmless bacterial spore, Bacillus glabigii, which has been used many times before in tracer studies. What they didn't tell them, and what they didn't know at the time, was that this stuff was regarded as a human pathogen. So they went ahead and they put it into envelopes. And in one trials, Porton Down mysteriously turned up with what they called weaponized BG, which sounds very sinister. This is the same stuff that Colin Powell turned up at the UN with a small vial and shook it and said this could take out the whole of New York City. It's BG, okay? So they went ahead and they went into these 3 sorting offices, and just before Christmas they released envelopes that contained this material into the automatic sorting machinery, and then all the postmen that were in the area were wearing samplers, and there were other portable vacuum samplers placed around the building, and they got an idea of how a sorting office would become contaminated and other mail would get contaminated. That year we all got something a little extra with our Christmas post. And that shows what they do. And that was a panic job. Since then, in 2002, they repeated the experiments, but they won't let on where. They did it again, I think, in 2004. The Royal Mail refused to give up any information on these trials.
So generally, should we conclude from this then, as far as we know, this policy is still in place? I mean, you have this letter from DERA, this is 1999. Let me quote from it exactly. In the event of a military question arising, which could only be answered by conducting open-air trials in areas which may involve the general public, and ministers have made it clear they cannot rule out the need to conduct larger scale trials in the future. So all that's necessary then, at least as I understand it, is that there to be a military question. That's really quite a vague statement there. And the policy is, yes, we can go ahead and do this. And if we understand that we are now living in what's normally called, the war on terror age, then presumably there is this background of need in the eyes of some people in the military establishment that, well, there is this possibility that anything could happen at any moment. We are in an ongoing war situation. There may be a military question at any moment. This could be enacted. Is that right, do you think?
Yeah, very right. In fact, there was been a little bit of fuss in the papers recently because a senior military officer gave a speech a few days ago at the Royal United Services Institute where he was saying the very same thing, that we could be subjected to bacteriological warfare, as he called it, at any time. He was talking more in the form of small-scale terrorist sabotage, i.e. pouring a bacterial solution into a salad bar or something like that. But you can see in the military's mind, it's very evident. There's one thing that I must point out is that any time that Porton Down say that we did this in the public interest, they did and they didn't. You see, Porton Down are only responsible for providing defensive and offensive equipment for the UK military. They're not there to protect the British public. The Home Office has that job. And the Home Office were kept very in the dark about a lot of this stuff that was going on. They did join in on the Norwich trials, and the Home Office did advocate, we don't know whether the trials were ever done, conducting further trials in the Norwich area using radioactivity tagged bacteria. But Porton Down, make no mistake, they only operate for the military. They're not there for your benefit or my benefit. It will be the Home Office doing that.
What do you feel then that we learn from this with respect specifically then to Porton Down and its ethical attitudes?
I don't know that we learn a lot. The biggest thing that we learn is that beware of scientists working in a very closed community. The government are the ones that enforce them into not being able to publish a lot of their findings. They live in this little bubble. They used to. I think it's a lot better now. But during the Cold War, they lived in a little bubble. They lived in houses provided for them by Porton Down. They all went to work together. They all ate and slept together. They had their own social club. It bred this hierarchical arrogance. And it's still present now. If you interview a Porton scientist, well, it was evident in the late 90s anyway, I say now. But in the late 90s, it was very evident that there is Porton Down and us. And they almost relish the fact that the members of the public are so ignorant as to not trust them. They like that. They like that idea. They say that they're misunderstood people.
And do you feel that there is some sense of the expendability of people in the sense of their behaviour being reckless at times?
Yes. I mean, a lot of people would like to use the information I provide or the research I've discovered, and I put it on the net. They like to use it to say, look, this is what they do to us, like as though it's on purpose. Right. I haven't found one scrap of evidence yet of a human member of the public being determined as a target. We're irrelevant. This is honestly, all it was is that we happen to live in a giant outdoor laboratory.
So the ends justify the means then. There's a greater good to be got from this as far as they're concerned. And if it causes collateral damage, as it were, well, that's just the way things have to be because this important research has to go on.
I think so. I think the Cold War was the overall thing that was going on. At the back of their mind, if they had any concerns, they said, well, someone else must be looking out for this. I mean, Rob Evans got a remarkable quote from a Porton scientist involved in the zinc cadmium sulfide trials, Mr. Titt, I think it was. And he says in there, well, cadmium is poisonous. Everyone knows that. All I know is, someone higher up was looking into it. We wouldn't have done it if otherwise. They all relied on this structure that someone somewhere must be looking into it. The classical one, if I talk to people about this and they say, oh, they wouldn't allow it. This mythical they. and what I found is, A, the government of the time was never joined up and the politicians were certainly kept in the dark. Porton Down itself, most of the people involved in there were comparted, so they didn't, they were in a compartment. They didn't know really anything that was going on. And of course, the other one I've got to lay in is that everyone would like to associate this research with the chemtrails concept.
Yes, do, please.
And I'd just like to point out the fact that all evidence is that if you want to disseminate a breathable particle, i.e. something between 1 and 5 micron, you can't do it above 1,200 feet. If you do it from an aircraft flying at 15, 10, 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet, this material won't come down. It just will not come down. It will fly forever. If you want to contaminate the population of the UK, you have far better luck sailing a boat along the English Channel and disseminating it from 10 foot. This material does not like being sprayed from very high up. So although these trials do prove that members of the public can get sprayed, if you want to physically spray them, there are far cheaper ways of doing it than spraying it with chemtrails.
Thank you for that. That's an interesting input, because that question has arisen a few times in the podcasts, and I'm rather neutral on the issue, as I've said to people.
Oh, something's going on. I'm sure something's going on, but I can't find evidence yet. If someone can provide me with the evidence, that's fine. But I do think a lot of people see a line in the sky and they point at it and say chemtrail.
Sure. Do you think there's something? This is off topic, but we're having this kind of conversation. So, do you think that this something, whatever it is that's going on, is actually global in scope?
I think that you've got pockets of people doing similar research, and being human beings, we like to try and link them. It's far safer to have a them to fight against than a lot of thems.
Sorry, I'm not asking for us to discuss the rationality of various theories, but but just purely on an evidential basis.
You have to go on the evidence. Yeah, have to go on the evidence. And so far, I haven't received anything. Maybe in 20 years' time, it'll be a Porton field trial report, and it'll pop up and it'll say the day we did a chemtrail.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned about government not being joined up back in the days of these experiments that you're researching. Do you think it's any more joined up these days? Do you feel that largely politicians don't know what's going on?
No, I don't think they know a lot at all. The Robin Day phrase, here today, gone tomorrow. They're not in the job long enough. It's impossible to be briefed on everything. Then there's the internal politics. I mean, Porton was just a hotbed of internal politics because they were trying to prove their existence. The microbiological research establishment part of it, anyway. They were always under the threat that, they'd be disbanded at some time or other. So they always had to put the best possible spin on things. And that would involve cultivating certain people, and you want to get the chief scientist on your side, and you get the chief scientist on side, and he'll pull the wool slightly over the minister's eyes. I think it goes on all the time. Yeah. I mean, say that you've got a small-scale experiment and you want to spray a small aerosol just over Portland. Would you waste the minister's time with it? I don't know. Only if it was politically a threat. Scientifically, I don't think the minister could care less. And everyone relies on there being this mythical they who would stop this. We all expect the health and safety executive to come flying in, but then when I contacted them once, they turned around and said, well, it's not our job. We do health and safety at work. We don't do anything about environmental matters. That's a part, that will be DEFRA. And you go to DEFRA, and DEFRA say, well, we don't have anything to do with that. That will be Porton Down. And you can get the runaround. No, there is no one responsible, I don't think. And of course, what muddies the waters more now than during the Cold War is, in Britain at least, is the fact that most of our research is being privatised. So then you've included another load of vested interests coming in.
Yeah.
So then you'd have lobbyists turning up at the minister saying, look, we want to spray Portland, it would help jobs in the area.
The more and more
I know that's being facetious. But.
Sure. Well, the more and more things that you say along these lines, I'm wondering how this could be considered to be analogous or kind of parallel to the revelations we've had about GCHQ and NSA. I mean, do we have a sort of situation here with Porton Down where, the real policy is being carried out there? The government is pretty much irrelevant, just as it is with the NSA, GCHQ. They have a life of their own and they call the shots and they keep people in the dark.
Yes. I'm pretty sure that was certainly the case during the Cold War. They openly admit that. They say that in most experiments, authority to conduct the experiments in public areas came from no higher than within, the director of the establishment. Sometimes they say less than that. Sometimes they conduct an experiment and spray zinc cadmium sulfide and had not even gone to the director level. It was no more than the supervisor said, yeah, okay, let's go and do that. I'm pretty sure that would still carry on now, except for they have to fill in health and safety. So as long as they fill in the health and safety sheet, that's fine. I mean, I asked what the current procedures are at Porton Down now, and one thing that's changed that they never used to do in the Cold War is that they put a sampling device at the edge of the wire of their range where they're testing. So if they test on the Porton range, they also now bothered to put a sampling device where it would enter the public areas, whereas before they never bothered. Well, you see, they operated under the idea that as long as we actually spray the substance on the Porton range and the sampling devices on the Porton range, what happens to the material afterwards is not our business. And they know it will go a couple hundred miles.
Yeah. And did you say they put this device there under pressure?
No, I don't know. I think after the advent of the Freedom of Information Act, I think they thought it might be a good idea.
Right.
I must admit, they are a lot more open than they used to be. And I will warn people that if you want to go after any information, Porton have got an enormous secret that they'd rather not people know, and the Ministry of Defence don't like to really admit it, is that all documents, the sort of like semi-important documents, the highly classified stuff from the former microbiological research establishment used to be kept in 2 containers, and they were just left lying there from 1979 right the way up until the 1990s. Then they decided that it better be put into a Ministry of Defence archive, and the Ministry of Defence at the time was privatising its archives, so they gave it to a certain organisation. So they gave them these 2 containers, plus all the reference numbers for these documents. And this private firm went and lost the reference numbers and gave them a new set of reference numbers. And in the old days, it used to be, we can't let you have the document, it's been in a fire, or you can't have a document because it's contaminated by asbestos. The latest one is, you can't have the document because a certain organisation has lost it in a huge warehouse. And the Ministry of Defence refused to spend money to have all this material examined and re-referenced. So in other words, they spend money with a private company to look after an entire set of records that are useless because no one can access them.
Do you think there's a possibility that was a deliberate strategy?
I don't think so. I think it is a classic demonstration of Porton Down at work.
Okay. So I suppose my last question really about this is, well, what would you say would ideally, well, not just ideally, but what could practically be done to bring Porton properly into the light?
Porton would argue that there's certain things that must remain secret. I can't think what they are at the minute. I don't know. I mean, it's very difficult to know what to do with Porton Down. They hide behind the fact that they are a military establishment, and it's very difficult for them to let go of that culture, I'm afraid. The only thing that you can do is that you've got an oversight committee that's got teeth and that can offer prison sentences. That would make them think. But apart from that, I think that they say, well, you've got to trust us.
Well, how can we trust them when they've lied so many times? It's incredible.
Well, this is it, you see. I mean, I've seen the director was interviewed in 1997, and he said, we certainly wouldn't conduct the trials like we did then nowadays. Unfortunately, the reporter didn't ask him why. What was so different then to now? So he was basically admitting that the stuff in the past was dangerous, and it was done in a bad way. And he's saying, well, you've got to trust us now. And we say to them, well, no, look, we want you to be more open. And they say, we are being more open to a point. If the national interest comes into it, obviously they're going to lie. All government organisations will lie.
Yeah.
Because they say that they're lying with our interests at heart. Trust us.
So would you agree really then that the best thing that we can do is to continue to make sure that we are staring at what is going on and talking about this so that there is a very keen awareness? Yeah,
I think the most important thing you can do is that for more people to become aware that what was done in the past is not something that should be just dismissed. It did put a lot of people at serious risk of harm. And it was very, very extensive. Between 1949 and 1976, and I mean, you've got to bear in mind, that's all the documents that the Ministry of Defence have ever released. We don't know what happened from 76 onwards. So 49 to 76, they did over 350 separate public area trials. The vast majority, well, all of those involved the release of live bacteria. And a lot of them were what they called massive crosswind line releases. And when a civil servant uses the word massive, he means it.
I'm not sure whether you actually have a website where you keep the research that you've been engaged in over the years. You certainly have a very, very active Twitter account. Could you give people an idea of where they can find out more information about your research specifically?
Yeah, I mean, my Twitter account, it's not a boast. It's called @Wellbright, WELBRIGHT. It's a government code name that I just adopted to use for my Twitter account. And also, I'll provide you with a link, actually. That would be better. I did put the 1975 trials document that I managed to get declassified. I have put that into a blog. It does explain the background to the simulants, and it shows what trials were done in 1975. I think if you type in Night Ferry, the Night Ferry and Porton Down, that should just give you a link to the site. I am trying to work on a full-scale blog, because obviously, all this information must come out. I've got thousands of pages of it.
Absolutely. Yes, and I do need to stress to people that your Twitter account is not just a regular one. It has got a lot of information on it, hasn't it?
Go back through the timeline, if you can, on it. And I don't just cover Porton Down. I mean, obviously, I cover other aspects that the government rather don't want to talk about.
Yeah.
Everything virtually is Cold War orientated. The vast majority is stuff that's got from the Freedom of Information Act. And there's some very amazing stuff that is out there. Well worth a read.
And do you want to say something about your YouTube account as well?
Yeah, my YouTube account is Experiments Are Us. What I've done on there is I've put on any declassified film that I can manage to get from the Ministry of Defence. They're mainly Porton Down orientated, virtually all of them are, or they're the various television productions which have used my research. So that would be the Top Secrets Revealed, or the Clouds of Secrecy, which covered the Norwich trials, and various other bits and bobs that were in the news at the time when the Lyme Bay trials were first coming out, including, there's a nice little item in there from Spotlight Southwest, which 4-minute piece, which just show what happened with the Swanage trials in 1959.
Yes, I found that fascinating. Before we formally close here, is there anything that you feel that we've not mentioned in the conversation you think is important to share with people as a parting comment?
Well, the main thing is, and I really want to encourage people to do it, don't be frightened to put in a Freedom of Information request if you're concerned about anything. Be prepared to play the long game. Don't be confrontational. It's pointless. You're dealing with a person that has probably got no more power than the average person behind the counter at your post office. Be as nice as you can to them. The Freedom of Information officers generally try and help. You do get the occasional one that gives you the brush off. Be persistent.
And it does work, because you've got an awful lot of information.
And it really does work. I mean, it took me 3-4 years to get Operation Cauldron film out. That's on my YouTube account. The Ministry of Defence point blank refused to release that. Then they were going to take it to court. And in the end, I had to involve the Information Commissioner's Office. And this is one of those occasions where it all worked. The system worked. And the Ministry of Defence were forced to release a very, very important film.
Well, Mike Kenner, thank you ever so much for joining us on the podcast. It's been a massive conversation. There's a huge amount of information here. You have given me the most headache of an editing job I think I have. I really do admire all this work that you've done over the years. I'm very grateful to you for it. It has been a wonderful conversation, really interesting. So thank you ever so much indeed.
Thank you. Keep in contact, Julian. Very interesting. You made that very painless.
Right. Great to talk to you.
All right, then.
Bye-bye.
Bye.